Thank you all for having me here, especially, of course, Gil for inviting me and the Faculty of Media and Communication. I also want to thank all the presenters who were really amazing these 2 days and whose thoughts were very inspiring and provoking. And to try to link my presentation, especially with the Gil's introduction on the first day, which began with the floods, and because I feel that I'm representing, in a way, Belgrade here, today I will have my presentation with the title, After Whom the Deluge, of course combining After Whom the Bells Tolls and After Me the Deluge. So I will begin my presentation in a somewhat clumsy way with a clumsy opening. When I got the invitation letter to present here, I was quite indecisive about the topic, and Gil can justify a lot to this. This was not because I had doubts about both the urgency of thoughts and the necessity for thought, and not because I seem to think that ours is the time when this emergency is more important than ever before. Coming more from the 19th than from the 21st century, I would argue that there were no times when the thought itself was not urgent. However, being part of this time, having my thoughts on whichever temporal distant subject ingrained in what we assume by now, this immediate urgency of thought seems only more plain and exacting. So my vacillations lasted for months, and their main reason was my unwillingness to compromise. Namely, when I think and write in Serbian, most of the time I do that about England. But it so happened that when I academically have to think and write about Serbia, or for that matter, the region where I feel myself being at home, both in thoughts and in deeds, I then write in English. And this in itself was not an easy compromise. That feature, the easiest explanation of which can be found in the use of languages, but which also has its academic colonial origins, known well to those who are on the margins, periphery, or semi-periphery, as Dubravka Đurić mentioned yesterday, Marina Blagojević term, of the theoretical production, in my case feminist, or even worse, Victorianist theoretical production. So that feature was bridged by a common theme, and that is citizenship. My readings of Victorian struggles around class and sex citizenship might, and I hesitate again and I underscore this word slightly, so they might relate to my readings of activist citizenship in the region, which were basically done with a Cici theme, Igor Šteks being the representative of it here in Belgrade now. So thinking about citizenship, and I talked about that during the pause that we have, so I cannot help but once again slide into this linguistic space. Thinking about citizenship here in our BHS language sphere has its bourgeois connotations, because we're talking about građanstvo most of the time. If only because of the differences in paths towards citizenship. So this is something that we have to bear in mind when we talk about citizenship in Belgrade, in Serbian language at least. But also thinking about citizenship through feminist lenses proved itself not to be an easy task. For my purposes here today, it will suffice to quote a short paragraph from Sasha Rosnill's volume that she edited, and it was published last year, Beyond Citizenship, where she says, and I'm quoting, "The compulsive can't live with it, can't live without it quality of feminism's engagement with citizenship raises the question that any of us should ask of an attachment that has long seemed to offer so much, that tantalizes and teases, but it continues to fail to give us what we really want. Should we hang in there, trying to make the relationship work, or should we let go and move on?" End of quote. So my vacillations would probably last to this very day, although I have to say that I did make a decision to stick to a secure English variant of thinking about citizenship, assuring myself that feminist post-Yugoslav activist citizenship would be much more illuminating and interesting for the discussion than threadbare class and sex issues from Victorian England. However, floods came so overwhelmingly that I decided to change the whole stream of thoughts, which all of a sudden seemed not so urgent, and I began to write this paper, this piece of paper, on Monday night and had it finished on Wednesday night. So in advance, I have to say that I'm sorry if the thoughts that will be presented here are confusing, and so this is sort of pre-warning. Coming to a close of this clumsy opening, I wish to share with you two thoughts which came to me during the first days of floods. Even though they do not seem to have anything to do with citizenship, I hope I will be able to link them in some reasonable, thought, unoffending way. The first takes us back to Belgrade 15 years ago. It was April, the time when I was zealously reading for my ancient Greek philosophy exam. It was also the beginning of the second month of NATO bombing, and the time when having internet and cable TV was a huge privilege in Serbia, the one that my family used to have at the time. So being given the chance to have different approaches to truth, and utterly unaware of the existence of postmodernism at the time, completely submerged into Greeks, I was beginning to wonder, as any philosopher, or for that matter, philosophy student should be humbly doing, whether there was something we might name the truth. What was the truth about the bombing, and for me later on about the wars and then the post-war circumstances, was always a matter of bargain. Never something unclosed, undisclosed, or unconcealed, as the Greek word aletheia would make us want to believe or think. Later, I would completely dismiss truth as a valid issue. I would even say that what I wrote since had to do with processes and deceits. However, a couple of days ago, my 7-year-old daughter, commenting on the floods during our walk by the river Danube, the quiet one, fortunately, said something which really prompted me to think again of this and to ask myself with some urgency of thought what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about the truth, and especially about the truth of citizenship. She then said, "It is said that this has to be real." And when asked what does the real mean, she was unhesitant, that which must be true. But what is the truth about the deluge? Not that it is cataclysmic, as we hear all around the place every day, because that is exactly what cataclysm, kataklysmos, as I asked Marinos to prove, is. That is flawed in Greek. Not the height, the speed, or the amount of water which all of a sudden burst into unprepared Serbian towns, and we can find many words or phrases to emphasize in this sentence, to make it hear better. Not the wrath of God or the fury of rampant nature, although Serbian Orthodox Church representatives, but also the government representatives, did have something to say in the favor of this biblical apocalyptic symbolic. I would say that it would also be somewhat impetuously said that the truth of the floods lays barely in the decisions made by politicians, or rather lack of them or their mismanagement. If anywhere, this truth lies, and I have to say that it would be sensible to think again if this may be the most reasonable word to be used here or anywhere, for that matter. So if anywhere, the truth lies in what it is to be a citizen, the dead one, the evacuated one, the donation giver one, the Twitter activist one, in a word, a citizen during the floods. Enough said about the truth, at least for now, this wavering notion which often does nothing more than warns us that there will be deceptions and trickeries around. To paraphrase Derrida, who was talking about the time, in a sense, it is always too late to talk about the truth, it being so and always untimely. Let me for a moment then forget about it. Let me dismiss it once again as an insubstantial subject of thought. Instead, let us turn to one other ticklish term, too inconvenient for a mature academic discussion, so much so that we leave it to common people so often that it basically represents a thought barrier between us and them. Are we not flooded with the narratives about human nature, disguised in an equally represented share of do-gooders and evildoers? It seems to me that in the state of exception, human nature looms large. In the state of exception caused by the flood, citizenship becomes heightened, especially through the discourses of solidarity, or suspended. For those who, with eyes wide open, sell bread and water for a higher price, or for those who plunder empty houses or who manage to redirect donations to their own accounts, but also for those who dare to ignore, to neglect, to be oblivious to the cries for help. Obviously, types of suspension differ, but are nonetheless real, i.e. true. The actions that beg for suspension, and I will go back to solidarity shortly, are rather peculiar if not explained by whatever human nature is. They may be understood quite metaphorically as a form of insurrection or as a claim to the right to resist solidarity, and to go against the calls to be there with the victims and for the victims. It is a right to abandon scruples and at the utmost to not give away one's own time and one's own resources. In the state of exception defined by Agamben as an anomic space in which what is at stake is a force of law without law, we are not dealing only with the fringes of legal normativity and political factuality. When floods are the cause of the state of exception, we cannot merely say with Agamben that either all power and all legal structures are abolished or that the plentitude of law coincides with the totality of the real. What lurks behind this specific anomaly is indeed a mystical element, another phrase by Agamben, which cannot be explained by sheer illegality or by pure violence. The right not to have the heart or to have it suspended and to consequently suffer suspension, be it by the police or army, mass media, or by casual acquaintances, is not promulgated by the laws of citizenship, which is in the last instance blind to the presence or absence of one's ability to grieve and to act in accordance with one's grief. Citizenship is differently defined as a triad of status, rights, and identity by Jobke, or as polity membership expressed by the triple complex of rights, access, and belonging by Wiener, or similarly as a triad of membership, rights, and practices by Baubeck. During the state of exception caused by the deluge, when we are at the same time more and less citizens than in non-exceptional time, what comes forth is specifically human dimension of citizenship, in contrast to its more documental dimension during the non-exceptional times. We tend to see bereaved people as figures that embody sorrow, grief, and anger, and to take their embodiment as ours, to transfigure ourselves into mourners. We belong more, we practice more, and we identify more. But what do we identify with? Who exactly do we mourn for? Do we belong more to our own suffering nation, region, city, neighborhood, or to some radical idea of humaneness? And thus, identification and belonging to whichever formation force us to practice our grief, to activate it, to make it into something productive. Or are we becoming paralyzed as citizens without a public language which is so ultimately appropriated by the state of exception itself? This issue of public language is enmeshed with the question of our identity as citizens. When we act, are we acting in solidarity with the people, our people? Are we Serbians then? Or are we perhaps ex-Yugoslavs, since the floods once again tied inhabitants of quote-unquote West Balkans or quote-unquote CE region in some sort of geographical waterway brotherhood and unity? Or are we maybe talking about class solidarity, as one early Facebook status ran? And I'm quoting, "These are the finest examples of class solidarity." It is interesting, but also urgent in terms of economic landslide we're already experiencing, and with a view to what will come after the deluge, to think of solidarity as having to do with class. Radne akcije, working actions, the term that is well known to everyone coming from any part of former Yugoslavia here. Radne akcije, which again sprung up in at least parts of the public language, seem comparable to actions that we witnessed around the riverbanks these days. The identity of the citizen involved in these new forms of radne akcije cannot be, however, as easily transposed into something which once brought the new country, common country, to life. There are namely conflicting politics of remembrance, but also, and maybe even more important, conflicting politics of imagination, thought of in generational terms, because large amounts of people who were by the riverbanks these days have only heard of radne akcije and not necessarily in the best of ways. But there is also one significant aspect of identity or belonging or practicing one's citizenship here. Think of the heroes of radne akcije, working actions, after the Second World War, when roads, factories, railroads, and the like were built. The heroes were the working people of Yugoslavia, the proletariat, which consisted of men and women, or at least this is how we are taught to remember or to imagine them. Today, however, we have visible and less visible, so-called quiet heroes, tihi heroi, many of them of very different origin, for example, foreign, especially Russian saviors, because we're in Serbia here, unexpectedly brotherly behaving Croats, Chinese who gave away rubber boots for free, nula dinara, and many a men who practiced their belonging in certain laudable ways. Some of them are dead, like the first victim of the flood, the firefighter who jumped into the water to save one life, while others deserve this title because they, I quote, played the match of their life, and I think here of the American football team, Vukovi, Wolves, not a very common sport in Serbia, after they defended whatever part of Serbia they thought fittest. In the time when monuments have lost their purpose of being the stone or metal congealment of the heroism of the many, we deal with the flood of individual living and dead heroes. But there is one thing which unites all of the heroes. They are all men. I'm purposefully not using gender as a term to denote their commonality, because disputability of the concept aside, to which I myself subscribe, gender has to be the place for the expression of variety of masculinities and femininities, and also the space of belonging to a variety of masculinities and femininities. But here, there is no variety. Heroism, fighting, and building belongs to men, to those whose bravery and courage was called upon on the very day when the state of exception was declared. For those of you who don't know, I will just say quickly that the Prime Minister of Serbia asked for 1,000 courageous men, with a stress on the courage. So he asked for 1,000 courageous men to go and defend Šabac, a western town in Serbia, western Serbian town, because Šabac must not fall. Not 1,000, but many 1,000 men felt that this call-up was directed to them. And those who did not had to wonder about how brave they were. And why were they not braver? Why were they not men enough? From the very same day mantra, women, children, elderly, put those less eligible citizens on the other side of heroism, but also on the other side of practicing citizenship. Men are assigned with agency. They have to stay and defend their own. They have to earn their dignity and independence from the state, but also from the party and politicians. The state will help, but it is you who needs to get involved. Serbia needs you, as one jingle says. On the other hand, the incantation, women, children, elderly, deprives of independence, agency, ability to fight and defend, and prescribes both what it is to be brave for men and for women. In those rare portrayals of women's heroism, there were, I counted 3 in these 10 days of flood now. Valiant womanly behavior had to be portrayed in a motherly way. One of the titles ran Mother Courage, of course. Therefore, we have a sex difference of belonging and practicing one's own citizenship, and this difference is emphasized so strongly that this state of exception questions not only our duties as humans and citizens, but also as gendered beings. We are cut into 2. Men do and are heroes, women feel and are sufferers, or alternatively, and less so, caretakers. But binaries are not present only in terms of what one is harboring between one's legs. What was also assumed, at first at least, is that the people are either young and able, or old and disabled, or at least less abled. Those who were evacuated were either healthy and sane, presumably women with children, or less healthy and less sane, presumably elderly. Illnesses were not included. However, being a citizen also means being unwell, infirm, insane, having cancer, stomach flu, AIDS, LACEs, being diagnosed with a psychosis. All of these might have been part of someone's life before the evacuation, thus before the deluge. When we think of citizens in a non-exceptional state, provided that they are not related to us in any way, in other terms, that we don't know anything private about them, we tend to see them as impersonal beings who appear in the shared public, furnished by and interlinked by documents of all sorts. However, the shelters, in Serbian language, prihvatilišta, which means places where you are received and accepted, so the shelters are now representing an open narrative of privacy, private effects, private histories, but also the bodily privacy of citizenship, perhaps even contagious, and we all fear contagion, which burst out to bedazzle our neat distinction of public and private, where private is seen and thought of as hidden, unseen, and sheltered. I'm close to the end. The last 2 thoughts will have to briefly focus on the role of the state, which proclaims the state of exception, and on the media, which communicates its public language. Even though the invitation letter came from the Faculty of Media and Communication, I cannot profess myself to be any expert in media, not being an ardent consumer of them at all. But the only reason why I'm mentioning it here is to underline the tremendous and basically unbearable velocity which is an entwined velocity of information and of reality, whatever that is. Thinking, and I'm thinking here about Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind, of course, thinking always begs for a pause, for at least imagined standstill, for an interruption in time, and partial resignation from reality. But during the deluge state of exception, there is an inability to stand still, an inability to delay imbibing pictures, words, sounds, and to try and think about the scene heard and understood, but also about the public language which serves to cater us with those pictures and words. And not less importantly, about the state which prescribes the uniformity of the public language. This heavy velocity produces a sort of giddiness, nauseous, loss of balance, and there is a strong urge to direct thoughts, accompanied, unfortunately, with an utter confusion about their possible directions. Thus, when men do and women feel, who should be doing the thinking? As citizens, we are assured that the state, and through its many representatives, does the thinking for and instead of us all. During the state of exception, when citizenship is at the same time heightened and suspended, the citizens are obliged to believe more than in any other non-exceptional times, that solidarity aside, which comes as a sort of bonus, state actions are our actions, or our actions are basically state actions. I'm coming to a concluding thought, which is that the paradox of feeling, thinking, and doing for or instead of someone else is crucial here. Let us once again, and for the final time, return to the truth of citizenship, to identification, belonging, and practice. When the enemy is defined as a superabundance of water, as it is now, and not as some recognizable enemy, some recognizable other with big O, and we used to have several of them here, then what is it that we are identifying with? Are we identifying with the state? How do we belong, and in contrast to what? And how do we practice our belonging and identification? In the absence of the real enemy, looters and unscrupulous grocers aside, being a citizen during the floods means being overwhelmed by one's own misfortune and sorrow, or by the inability to feel, do, and think enough. When the national days of mourning, which were over 2 days ago now, and soon after that, the state of exception itself would come to an end, the question about the right to continue with the normal life, the right to resist practice, and guilt for not practicing or not practicing enough, that would be the very truth of citizenship, untimely as ever. Thank you.